He had just wired $50 million before lunch, and yet he couldn't spare 5 seconds for a girl shivering on the sidewalk. The most powerful man in the city almost drove past the one person who was about to change his life forever. The December wind cut through downtown Chicago at 20 miles per hour, slicing between glass towers and rattling the bare branches lining West Madison Street. Snow from the night before had turned into gray slush along the curb, soaking through worn sneakers that were at least one size too small. 14-year-old Lily Harper stood beneath a flickering streetlight outside St. Anne's Medical Center. Her thin wool coat buttoned all the way to her chin, a woven basket of carnations and daisies hanging from her arm. Each bouquet cost $5. She needed $247 by the end of the week. That was the exact price of her mother's next round of medication, the pharmacist had said, tapping the receipt with quiet sympathy. Lily's fingers were red from the cold, but she kept rearranging the flowers, brushing off melting snowflakes, as if presentation alone could convince strangers to care. Office workers hurried past her in tailored coats, eyes fixed on phones, heels clicking against pavement. A city bus roared by, spraying mist into the air. She swallowed and stepped forward anyway. "Fresh flowers, $5, she called softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her bones. Across the intersection, a black Rolls-Royce idled at a red light, its polished surface reflecting the hospital's glowing sign. Inside sat Ethan Caldwell, 42 tech billionaire wrapped in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Lily's rent for 6 months. He glanced up absently, irritated by the delay, and for the briefest second, through tinted glass and swirling snow, his eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow between the red light and the falling snow. Lily lifted one small bouquet higher, her arm trembling from the cold, as if that simple motion could bridge the distance between the curb and the leather interior of the car. Ethan Caldwell did not roll down the window. He told himself he did not even see her clearly. He had a board meeting in 20 minutes, a merger worth $120 million, waiting for his signature investors, expecting confidence and precision. He adjusted his cufflinks instead and looked forward, watching the traffic signal count down from 12 to 11 to 10. Yet something about the way she stood there refused to fade. She was not begging. She was not chasing cars. She simply waited, chin-lifted, shoulders squared, like someone twice her age carrying a responsibility no child should understand. The light turned green. The Rolls-Royce moved forward, smooth and silent, leaving behind the scent of exhaust and melting snow. Lily lowered her arm slowly, but did not let disappointment show on her face. She stepped back onto the sidewalk, shifting her weight to keep feeling in her toes. She counted the bills in her coat pocket again. $38. Not even close. Inside the hospital across the street, her mother lay in a narrow bed under fluorescent lights, trusting her daughter to come back with good news. Lily inhaled deeply, forcing warmth into her lungs, and approached the next pedestrian with the same steady voice. She would not go home without trying again. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees, and the sky turned the color of dull steel above the hospital towers. Lily Harper could no longer feel the tips of her fingers, but she kept her grip firm around the basket, as though letting go would mean surrender. She had sold 3 more bouquets in the past 2 hours, each exchange marked by a polite smile and a quiet thank you. $43 became $58, then $63. Still far from what the pharmacist had written in blue ink. Every time the sliding doors of St. Anne's Medical Center opened, warm air drifted out for a few precious seconds before disappearing again. Lily watched families walk in, carrying balloons and paper bags, their footsteps quick and purposeful. She imagined her mother inside, pale against white sheets, pretending to be stronger than she felt. Sarah Harper always smiled, even when her breathing was shallow, always told Lily that things would turn around soon. Lily believed her because she had to. Across town, Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of a 20-foot conference table surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows, and men in tailored suits. Numbers filled the large screen behind him, projections climbing into the hundreds of millions. Applause followed his final signature, yet in the reflection of the glass, instead of charts and graphs, he kept seeing a thin girl under a flickering streetlight holding flowers that were slowly freezing in her hands. The image returned without invitation, steady and persistent. When the meeting ended, he did not head straight home to his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Instead, he told his driver to take a different route back through West Madison Street, though he did not explain why. The Rolls-Royce slowed as it turned onto West Madison Street, headlights cutting through the early winter dusk. Snow began to fall again, light but steady, dusting the sidewalks and settling on the shoulders of anyone still outside. Ethan Caldwell sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed ahead, though he told himself he was only choosing this route to avoid traffic near Lakeshore Drive. The driver pulled to a stop near the hospital entrance when a delivery truck blocked part of the lane. Through the tinted window, Ethan saw her again, beneath the same flickering streetlight. Lily Harper stood straighter now, as if the cold had forced her body into stillness. Her basket looked lighter. Only a few bouquets remained, their petals slightly wilted from hours in the freezing air. She stepped toward a passing couple, offering a small smile that did not quite reach her tired eyes. They shook their heads and kept walking. Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. Not guilt exactly, but a quiet discomfort that refused to be ignored. He leaned forward slightly. This time he did not look away. He noticed the way her coat sleeves were too short at the wrists, the way she shifted her weight to keep blood flowing to her feet, the way she glanced at the hospital doors every few minutes, as if measuring time against hope. The driver cleared his throat softly, waiting for instruction. Ethan hesitated, fingers resting on the door handle. He had built an empire by making fast decisions, by never letting emotion cloud judgment. Yet this moment felt strangely complicated. The delivery truck finally moved and traffic began to flow again. The car could have continued forward without pause. Instead, after a long breath, Ethan spoke quietly and told the driver to pull over along the curb just a few yards ahead of the girl selling flowers in the snow. The car door opened with a soft, controlled sound that seemed almost too refined for a street layered in gray slush and scattered salt. Warm air spilled out briefly before disappearing into the cold. Lily Harper noticed the movement, but did not immediately assume it was meant for her. Expensive cars sometimes stopped near the hospital entrance, but they rarely stopped for someone like her. Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the pavement, the polished leather of his shoes touching ground that had soaked through her sneakers hours ago. Snow settled lightly on his dark overcoat, but he did not brush it away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was only a few steps, yet it carried the weight of two entirely different worlds. Lily adjusted the basket on her arm and approached first, because hesitation did not pay for medicine. "Fresh flowers, $5, she said, her voice steady despite the wind that tugged at her hair. Up close, Ethan could see that her cheeks were flushed from more than just the cold. There was determination there, and exhaustion, and something else he could not immediately name. He glanced at the small bouquets, at the careful way they had been wrapped in simple brown paper. "How many do you have left?" he asked, his tone even almost formal. "7, she replied. "They are still good. They were fresh this morning." She did not lower her eyes. She did not plead. She simply presented the offer as a transaction. Ethan studied her for another second, noticing the hospital bracelet peeking faintly from her coat pocket, likely from visiting someone inside. Traffic moved around them, horns distant and impatient. The city did not slow down for moments like this. "Are you raising money for something specific?" he asked quietly. Lily hesitated for the first time, her grip tightening around the basket, as if deciding how much of her truth to hand to a stranger standing in a coat worth more than everything she owned. For a brief moment, Lily considered giving him a simple answer, something distant and polite, but the truth pressed against her chest harder than the winter air. It is for my mother, she said finally, her voice calm but quieter now. She is upstairs. She needs medication, and insurance does not cover all of it. She spoke the words carefully, as if each one carried weight. Ethan listened without interrupting. The hospital doors slid open behind her, releasing another wave of warm air mixed with the faint scent of disinfectant. Lily continued before he could respond. I am not asking for donations, she added quickly. I am selling flowers. $5 each. There was pride in the correction. Not defiance. Pride. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. He had funded entire medical research centers, written checks that could rebuild wings of hospitals. Yet this girl stood in the cold, determined to earn $247 on her own terms. How much have you raised so far? He asked. Lily shifted slightly, snow crunching beneath her shoes. $63, she answered. I will stay until I sell the rest. Her confidence sounded practiced, as though she had repeated the sentence to herself all afternoon. Ethan glanced at the remaining bouquets. 7 flowers, $35 more. Still far from what she needed. He reached into his coat and removed his wallet, the leather smooth and worn from use. He could have handed her a stack of bills large enough to solve the problem in seconds. Instead, he paused again, sensing that the way he acted in this moment mattered more than the amount itself. I will take all 7, he said evenly. Lily blinked, surprised but cautious. That will be $35, she replied, already calculating the total in her head. Ethan handed her the exact amount in crisp bills. No more. No less. She counted it carefully before offering him the bouquets. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, her skin icy against his. Thank you, she said, meeting his eyes without hesitation. For the first time that day, Ethan felt the cold in the air instead of inside himself. The exchange should have ended there. Ethan could have returned to his car, placed the flowers on the empty seat beside him, and driven back to a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, where heat, light, and silence waited without question. Instead, he remained standing on the curb, 7 small bouquets gathered awkwardly in one hand, watching as Lily tucked the $35 carefully into the inner pocket of her coat. She stepped back toward the streetlight, already scanning the sidewalk for the next passerby, even though her basket was now empty. You are finished for today, he observed. Lily shook her head gently. I still need more, she said. I will come back tomorrow morning. The wind shifted sharper now, pushing snow across the pavement in thin streaks. Ethan glanced at the hospital entrance. Is your mother alone? He asked. Lily hesitated, then nodded once. She thinks I am studying at the library, she admitted. She does not like me being out here. There was no complaint in her tone, only a quiet acceptance of responsibility. Ethan studied her face more closely, trying to understand how someone so young could carry herself with such measured composure. $63 had become $98 with his purchase, still far from $247. He felt the math settle heavily in his mind. What is her name? He asked. Sarah Harper, Lily replied without looking away. The name lingered in the cold air. Something about it stirred faintly in Ethan's memory, though he could not place why. A car horn sounded behind them, impatient and sharp. His driver waited by the open door. Lily took a small step back, signaling that the moment was over. Thank you for buying the flowers, she said again, sincere but composed. Ethan gave a short nod and returned to the car, the door closing softly behind him. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, he looked through the rear window and saw her cross the street toward the hospital. Her thin figure swallowed gradually by falling snow and fluorescent light. For reasons he could not explain, the name Sarah Harper continued echoing in his thoughts long after West Madison Street disappeared behind them. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed softly above polished floors that reflected every step. Lily Harper paused near the entrance to warm her hands against a wall vent before walking toward the elevator. $98 rested securely inside her coat, folded flat, and counted twice. It was progress, but it was not enough. She stepped into the elevator beside a nurse reviewing a clipboard and a man holding a paper cup of coffee, the scent rich and warm against the sterile air. When the doors opened on the fourth floor, Lily moved quickly down the corridor, memorizing the rhythm of her footsteps so they would not sound uncertain. Room 417 waited at the end of the hall. She entered quietly. Sarah Harper lay propped against thin white pillows, her complexion pale but her eyes alert. "You were at the library a long time," her mother said, gently offering a small smile. Lily returned it without hesitation. "I had extra homework," she replied smoothly, setting her backpack on the chair. She did not mention the wind or the snow or the way her toes still burned from the cold. She sat beside the bed and took her mother's hand, careful to hide the redness in her own. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell sat alone in the back seat of his car as it moved through evening traffic. The 7 bouquets rested on the leather beside him, their petals already softening in the warmth. He glanced at them, then at his reflection in the darkened window. Sarah Harper. The name felt familiar in a distant, unfinished way. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then placed it back into his coat pocket. It would be simple to forget. It would be easier to move on. Yet as Lake Michigan came into view under a sky turning indigo, he realized that the image of a girl standing under a flickering streetlight with quiet dignity had followed him home, and it did not seem ready to leave. That night, the wind intensified, sweeping across the city at nearly 30 miles per hour and pressing against the tall windows of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse. From 40 stories above Lake Michigan, the world looked orderly and distant, reduced to lines of headlights and muted reflections on dark water. Ethan stood in his living room jacket, removed tie, loosened the 7 bouquets resting in a crystal vase on the marble counter. They looked small in a space designed for statements and scale. He poured a glass of water, but did not drink it. Instead, he stared at the flowers and repeated the name silently. Sarah Harper. The familiarity sharpened slowly, like a photograph coming into focus. 20 years earlier, in a different hospital across the city, a young entrepreneur on the verge of collapse had been rushed into emergency surgery after a sudden medical crisis. He had been 22, terrified, and alone. He remembered a nurse who stayed past her shift, who spoke calmly when machines beeped too loudly, who told him he would be all right, even when he doubted it himself. He had never forgotten her voice, only her face. Harper. The memory landed heavily in his chest. Across town, Lily remained seated beside her mother's hospital bed long after visiting hours ended. The corridor lights dimmed slightly, and the hallway grew quiet except for the distant roll of carts and soft conversations at the nurse's station. Lily counted her money again under the blanket, the bills flattened against her palm. $98. She calculated the difference in her head. 149 more to go. Tomorrow she would arrive earlier before the morning rush. She would stand closer to the entrance. She would not waste a single hour. Sarah watched her daughter carefully. "You do not have to worry about everything," she said gently. Lily forced a small smile. "I know," she replied, though both of them understood that she did. In the penthouse, Ethan picked up his phone at last and scrolled through archived medical records stored in a private file he had never opened again. It took only minutes to confirm what he already suspected. Registered nurse, Sarah Harper. The same hospital network. The same year. Ethan lowered himself into a chair, staring out at the frozen horizon. The girl under the streetlight was not a coincidence. She was a reminder. And now the question was no longer whether he would get involved, but how far he was willing to go. Morning arrived, pale and brittle sunlight reflecting off a thin sheet of ice that had formed along the sidewalks overnight. Lily Harper returned to West Madison Street before 7 o'clock, breath visible in the freezing air as she arranged a fresh batch of carnations and daisies into neat bundles. She had woken before dawn on the narrow hospital chair, kissed her mother's forehead gently, and promised to be back before noon. $98 remained folded inside her coat, secured with careful precision. She positioned herself closer to the hospital entrance, this time determined not to lose momentum. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell did not go to his office. Instead, he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the city skyline, the confirmed medical record still open on his tablet. Sarah Harper had worked double shifts the week he had been hospitalized 2 decades earlier. Notes in the file mentioned extended bedside monitoring beyond assigned hours. He remembered waking in the middle of the night to the sound of a steady voice telling him to breathe slowly. He remembered feeling less alone. That memory had carried him through the hardest years of building his company, though he had never searched for the woman who gave it to him. Now he understood that gratitude delayed too long begins to resemble neglect. By 8:30, Lily had sold 2 bouquets, $10. She thanked each customer with the same composed smile, though the wind cut sharper than the day before. Traffic thickened as commuters hurried toward glass towers and heated offices. She checked the time on the large digital clock above the hospital entrance. Every minute outside felt like a minute taken from her mother's bedside, yet every minute was necessary. A black Rolls-Royce appeared at the far end of the street and slowed gradually. This time it did not pass. It parked directly along the curb beside her. Ethan stepped out without hesitation, the cold striking his face immediately. Lily looked up, surprised but steady. "You came back," she said simply. Ethan studied her for a long second, seeing not only a determined 14-year-old, but the echo of a nurse who once refused to leave a frightened young man alone. "I have something important to ask you," he replied quietly. Snow began to fall again, fine and persistent, settling on the flowers between them, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Snow gathered lightly on Lily Harper's shoulders as she faced Ethan Caldwell again beneath the gray Chicago sky. The morning rush moved around them in steady waves, heels clicking engines, humming hospital doors, sliding open and closed with mechanical rhythm. Lily adjusted her grip on the basket and weighted her expression, cautious but composed. "What is your mother's room number?" Ethan asked, his voice calm, almost formal, yet carrying a weight that had not been there the day before. Lily hesitated, studying him carefully. Why she asked? It was not suspicion. It was protection. Ethan held her gaze. "Because I believe I know her," he said quietly. The words landed between them, fragile and unexpected. Lily's brow tightened slightly. "My mother does not know many people," she replied. "She has not worked in years." Ethan nodded slowly. "She worked 20 years ago," he said, "at St. Matthew's Medical Center. She was a nurse." Lily's breath caught for just a second. "Yes," she answered softly, "before she got sick." Ethan felt the confirmation settle deeply. The memory of a younger version of himself lying in a hospital bed, uncertain if his future would exist, rose with sharp clarity. He remembered a nurse who stayed beyond her shift, who spoke with steady reassurance when fear threatened to overwhelm him. He had been 22 and afraid of losing everything before it even began. "Your mother stayed with me one night when she did not have to," Ethan continued. "I never thanked her." Lily's posture shifted slightly, the wind tugging at loose strands of her hair. She searched his face for exaggeration, for insincerity, and found neither. "Room 417, she said at last. "But she does not like surprises." Ethan allowed a faint, almost restrained smile. "Neither do I," he replied. A pause settled between them, filled only by the sound of distant traffic and the soft crunch of boots on salted pavement. Lily glanced down at the remaining flowers. "I still need $139, she said, as if stating a simple fact of weather. Ethan looked at the hospital entrance, then back at her. The path in front of him felt clearer now, but also heavier. Gratitude delayed had turned into responsibility, and responsibility demanded more than buying flowers on a winter morning. The wind eased slightly, as if the city itself were listening. Ethan Caldwell looked at the hospital entrance, then back at Lily Harper, weighing a decision that felt far more personal than any contract he had ever signed. "I would like to see her," he said at last, his tone steady but sincere. Lily studied him for a long moment, measuring intention the way she had learned to measure change in a stranger's voice. She nodded once. "You can come with me," she replied, gathering the remaining flowers into her basket. They crossed the street together, Boots stepping carefully over patches of ice traffic, slowing briefly as they moved between lanes. Inside St. Anne's Medical Center, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The scent of antiseptic and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Lily led him to the elevator without speaking, pressing the button for the 4th floor. The ride upward felt longer than it should have. Ethan watched the numbers light up one by one, his reflection faint in the brushed metal doors. He had faced shareholders, regulators, and international negotiations without hesitation, yet now his pulse felt unexpectedly unsteady. When the elevator doors opened, Lily stepped out first, guiding him down the quiet corridor toward room 417. She paused outside the door. "She gets tired easily," Lily said softly. "Do not let her feel like she owes you anything." The words struck deeper than she intended. Ethan nodded. "I owe her," he answered simply. Lily opened the door. Sarah Harper looked up from her pillow, surprise flickering across her face as she saw her daughter enter with a tall man in a dark overcoat. "Mom," Lily said gently, walking to the bedside. "This is someone who remembers you." Ethan stepped forward, removing his coat slowly as if entering sacred ground. For a moment Sarah studied him, her brow faintly furrowed. Then recognition dawned, subtle but unmistakable. "You were the young man who would not sleep," she said quietly, a faint smile touching her lips. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had remained unfinished for 2 decades, finally finding its place. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, covering the city in a fragile layer of white, as if offering a chance to begin again. For a moment no one spoke, and yet the silence carried more history than any conversation could hold. Sarah Harper's eyes, though tired, were steady as they rested on Ethan Caldwell's face. "You were afraid," she said softly, her voice thinner than he remembered, but just as calm. "You kept asking if you were going to lose everything." Ethan swallowed the memory, striking him with unexpected force. He had been 22, ambitious and terrified, lying in a hospital bed, with machines monitoring every fragile breath. He had built nothing yet, but he had believed he was already on the edge of losing it all. "You told me that if I survived that night, I had a responsibility to do something meaningful with the time I was given," he replied quietly. Sarah's faint smile deepened. "I told you to rest," she corrected gently. "The rest was yours." Lily stood beside the bed, watching the exchange with growing confusion and quiet awe. She had never heard her mother speak about former patients, never heard this tone of recognition in her voice. Ethan stepped closer, emotion tightening his chest. "You stayed past your shift," he continued. "You held my hand when I thought I was alone. I never thanked you." Sarah's gaze softened. "You do not owe me thanks," she said. "Nurses do not count kindness in dollars." The words landed like a quiet challenge. Ethan felt the weight of the envelope in his coat pocket, prepared before he entered the hospital, heavy with more money than Lily could earn in months. He could place it on the bedside table and walk away, believing the debt settled. But looking at Sarah Harper, now frail yet dignified, he understood that money alone would not honor what she had given him. Lily shifted slightly, glancing between them. "Mom has another treatment scheduled this week," she said carefully. Protective but honest. "It is expensive." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. For frustration flickering across her face. Lily, she murmured, not wanting her daughter to carry that burden aloud. Ethan turned toward Lily, then back to Sarah, the decision forming not from impulse but from something far deeper. "You once told me that surviving meant using my second chance wisely," he said, his voice steadier now. "I have spent 20 years building companies. Perhaps it is time I build something that matters more." Outside the window, snow pressed gently against the glass, muting the noise of the city below. Inside room 417, gratitude transformed into purpose, and purpose demanded action far greater than a simple repayment. The air inside room 417 felt charged, as if the quiet hum of hospital machines had grown louder to witness what was unfolding. Ethan Caldwell stepped closer to the bed, removing the envelope from his coat pocket, but keeping it in his hand rather than placing it down. "I do not want this to be charity," he said carefully, looking directly at Sarah Harper. "You did not help me because you expected something in return. You helped me because it was right. I am here for the same reason." Sarah watched him with thoughtful eyes, measuring not the size of the envelope, but the sincerity behind his words. Lily stood at the foot of the bed, her fingers tightening around the strap of her basket, unsure whether to feel hopeful or cautious. "My treatment plan changed last month," Sarah admitted quietly. "Insurance covers part of it, but not enough." I did not want Lily worrying about numbers. Lily lowered her gaze, exposed but unashamed. Ethan felt the weight of those numbers pressing into the room. $247 had driven a 14-year-old into freezing wind. That realization settled deeply within him. "How much is the full course of treatment?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, pride flickering across her features. "It is more than we can manage right now," she said simply. Ethan nodded once. "Then let me manage it," he replied. The words were calm but firm, not impulsive, not exaggerated. Lily looked up quickly. "We are not asking for someone to rescue us," she said, her voice steady, though emotion edged its corners. Ethan met her gaze. "I am not rescuing you," he answered gently. "I am honoring a promise I made to myself a long time ago." He turned back to Sarah. "You told me that surviving meant living with intention. I built companies that changed markets, but I never returned to thank the person who stayed awake when I was afraid of closing my eyes. That was a failure on my part. Allow me to correct it." The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. Snow continued drifting outside, layering the city in white stillness. Sarah exhaled slowly, her strength visible even in vulnerability. "If you help us," she said softly, "let it not end here. There are others in these rooms who need the same chance." Ethan felt something shift again, larger than repayment, larger than gratitude. "It will not end here," he promised. And for the first time since he stepped into the hospital, Lily allowed herself to believe that the cold outside might finally be losing its hold. The promise lingered in the room like a fragile beam of light breaking through winter clouds. Ethan Caldwell did not wait for the feeling to fade. He stepped into the hallway and made a call that carried more urgency than any corporate negotiation he had handled in years. Within minutes, he was speaking directly to the hospital administrator, his voice calm but unwavering. He requested a full review of Sarah Harper's treatment plan, every cost itemized, every gap in coverage identified. When he returned to room 417, Lily was seated beside her mother, whispering something that made Sarah smile despite the fatigue in her eyes. Ethan paused at the doorway, absorbing the quiet strength between them. "It is done," he said simply. "All current and future treatments will be covered in full." Lily stood abruptly, disbelief flashing across her face. "Covered how long?" she asked, needing certainty. "For as long as necessary," Ethan replied. "And not only for your mother." He looked at Sarah. "You asked that this not end here. I have established a medical support fund effective immediately. It will begin with this hospital and expand citywide." Families who fall between insurance limits will not have to choose between medication and survival. The words were measured, but the impact was immense. Sarah's eyes filled not with weakness, but with relief that seemed to reach beyond her own bed. "You listened," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "I should have listened 20 years ago," he answered. Lily stepped closer, her voice trembling for the first time. "You do not have to do all of that," she said, overwhelmed by the scale of what she was hearing. Ethan met her gaze with quiet certainty. "I do," he replied. "Because once someone saves you from your worst night, you spend the rest of your life deciding what that second chance is worth." The room felt warmer, not because the temperature changed, but because fear was slowly loosening its grip. Outside, the snowfall began to lighten the sky, shifting from heavy gray to a softer shade. Hospital staff moved through the corridor, unaware that something transformative had just taken place behind one closed door. Inside room 417, gratitude evolved into something larger than repayment. It became legacy, and in that moment, the difference between a billionaire and a girl selling flowers no longer measured distance in dollars, but in the choice to act when it mattered most. By the end of the week, the change was no longer a promise spoken in a quiet hospital room, but a reality moving through official channels and signed documents. Hospital administrators confirmed that Sarah Harper's treatments were fully secured, not temporarily, not conditionally, but completely. Lily watched nurses enter the room with a different tone in their voices, less restrained, more assured. The tension that had hovered over every conversation about billing slowly dissolved. Sarah's next procedure was scheduled without hesitation, and for the first time in months, she closed her eyes at night, without calculating costs in the dark. Ethan Caldwell returned often, not with cameras or announcements, but with quiet consistency. He met with department heads, reviewed financial structures, and established the Harper Care Initiative, a fund designed to support patients whose insurance fell short of life-sustaining care. The initial endowment reached into the millions, structured carefully to expand beyond St. Anne's Medical Center and into other hospitals across Chicago. Yet inside room 417, the transformation felt far more personal. Lily no longer woke before dawn to stand in freezing wind. Instead, she sat beside her mother with textbooks open, catching up on assignments she had postponed. She still kept one dried carnation pressed inside her notebook, a reminder of the days when $5 meant hope. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the hospital window, Sarah reached for Ethan's hand. "You have given us peace," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head gently. "You gave it to me first," he replied. He realized then that the success he had chased for 2 decades felt different now, steadier, anchored to something that could not be measured by quarterly reports. Outside, winter still held the city in its grip, but inside the hospital walls, warmth returned in subtle ways. Laughter drifted more easily through the corridor. Lily began speaking about future plans again, about college applications and studying medicine someday. The fear that once narrowed her world to a single number on a pharmacy receipt began to lift. And as Sarah's strength slowly returned with each treatment, the space between survival and possibility widened into something neither of them had dared to imagine just weeks earlier. As weeks passed, the Harper Care Initiative began reshaping more than hospital ledgers. Social workers started referring families who once would have quietly delayed treatment. Parents who had been calculating rent against prescriptions found breathing room where there had only been pressure. Ethan Caldwell reviewed reports late into the night, not out of obligation, but out of a responsibility that now felt personal. He visited wards without announcement, speaking with administrators about gaps that still existed, asking questions that went beyond numbers. Each conversation traced back to a single winter morning under a flickering streetlight. Meanwhile, Sarah Harper's strength slowly returned. Color crept back into her cheeks, and the once constant fatigue began to loosen its hold. Lily noticed the difference first in small ways. Her mother sat upright longer. She laughed without running out of breath. She spoke about returning home instead of preparing for another hospital night. When the discharge day finally arrived, sunlight streamed across the polished floor as Lily helped pack a modest bag of folded clothes. The nurse who completed the paperwork smiled warmly, aware of the broader impact unfolding beyond this room. Outside the hospital entrance, snow had melted into clear pavement, revealing the first signs of early spring. Ethan stood near the curb as Lily guided her mother carefully through the sliding doors. The air felt lighter not only because winter was retreating, but because uncertainty had lost its grip. Sarah paused, taking in the city skyline that had once felt so distant from her hospital window. "I remember when you were afraid of tomorrow," she said quietly to Ethan. "You do not look afraid anymore?" Ethan considered her words. "I am not," he replied. "Because tomorrow finally feels shared." Lily looked between them, realizing that the connection formed here was not built on wealth or debt, but on something steadier. Gratitude had evolved into partnership. Survival had transformed into opportunity. As they walked toward the waiting car, Ethan glanced back at the hospital doors, aware that countless stories still unfolded behind them. Yet this one rooted in a girl who refused to beg, and a nurse who once refused to leave a frightened patient alone had already begun altering the course of many more lives than their own. Spring settled gently over Chicago, replacing sharp winds with milder air that carried the scent of thawing earth and distant lake water. The Harper Care Initiative expanded quietly but steadily, its impact no longer confined to one hospital corridor. Letters began arriving at Ethan Caldwell's office, handwritten notes from families who had received assistance at moments when hope had nearly slipped away. He read each one carefully, not delegating them to assistants, understanding that behind every line was a story as fragile as the one that had started this change. Sarah Harper attended her follow-up appointments with renewed strength, walking into St. Anne's Medical Center not as someone weighed down by uncertainty, but as someone reclaiming normal life. Nurses who once monitored her closely now greeted her with familiarity and pride. Lily returned to school full-time, her focus sharpened by everything she had witnessed. She volunteered on weekends at the hospital, assisting with paperwork and offering quiet encouragement to younger children waiting for appointments. The basket she once carried through winter streets now rested on a shelf in her room, no longer a tool for survival, but a reminder of resilience. One afternoon, Ethan visited the hospital to review the latest expansion proposal. He found Lily seated in the lobby helping an elderly patient complete insurance forms. She looked up and smiled, no longer guarded, no longer braced against disappointment. "We approved funding for 3 more hospitals," Ethan told her later, as they stood near the large windows overlooking the city. Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Mom says that kindness multiplies when it is given room to grow," she replied. Ethan considered how different his life felt compared to the months before that winter morning. Board meetings still filled his calendar. Investments still demanded strategy and foresight. Yet his definition of success had shifted. It was no longer measured only by growth charts and quarterly earnings, but by the quiet relief in a family's eyes when fear was replaced by possibility. As the sun lowered over Lake Michigan, casting long golden reflections across the water, Ethan realized that the girl he once noticed through tinted glass had not simply changed her own future. She had redirected his, and in that redirection, something far greater than repayment had taken root, steady and enduring. A year passed with the quiet steadiness of seasons turning without announcement. West Madison Street looked different now in early winter, not because the buildings had changed, but because Lily Harper no longer stood beneath the flickering streetlight with a basket in her hands. Instead, she walked past that same corner on her way to school, her backpack filled with textbooks and college brochures. Snow began to fall again, lighter this time, settling gently on the pavement. She paused for a brief moment where she once counted $5 bills against the wind. The memory no longer carried fear. It carried gratitude. Across the city, the Harper Care Initiative had expanded beyond Chicago, reaching hospitals in neighboring states. Ethan Caldwell reviewed annual impact reports that listed thousands of families' assisted treatments secured and children returning home with parents who no longer faced impossible choices. Yet numbers still felt secondary to the image that started it all. That afternoon, Ethan stood outside St. Anne's Medical Center waiting beside his car as Lily and Sarah exited after a routine checkup. Sarah walked confidently, her strength fully restored, her smile unburdened. "All clear," she said, her voice steady and warm. Lily glanced at Ethan with quiet pride. "You kept your promise," she told him. Ethan looked at both of them, the winter air crisp but no longer cruel. "We all did," he replied. As they stood together beneath falling snow, the space that once separated wealth and struggle felt replaced by something far more enduring. Not charity, not obligation, but shared purpose. And in that shared purpose, the cold of that first winter morning had finally given way to lasting warmth. Graduation day arrived beneath a clear June sky, the kind that stretched wide and blue over Chicago, as if offering the entire city a fresh beginning. Folding chairs filled the high school football field, parents fanning themselves in the early summer warmth, while students adjusted caps and gowns in nervous excitement. Lily Harper stood in line with her classmates, tassel brushing against her cheek, heart steady but full. 1 year earlier, she had measured time in pharmacy receipts and snowfall. Now she measured it in acceptance letters and future plans. Sarah sat in the front row, sunlight catching in her hair, strength returned to her posture. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell watched quietly, no longer as a distant benefactor, but as someone who had chosen to remain present. When Lily's name was called, applause rose across the field. She walked across the stage with calm confidence, accepting her diploma with hands that had once been red from winter cold. For a brief second, she glanced toward the stands, finding her mother's smile and Ethan's steady nod. The moment felt larger than ceremony. It felt like proof. After the ceremony, families gathered for photographs near the bleachers. Lily stepped away from the crowd and walked toward Ethan. From her small bag, she removed a single white carnation, fresh and carefully wrapped. "For your office," she said softly. Ethan accepted it with a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. The flower symbolized not hardship but growth. Around them, laughter and conversation filled the air, ordinary and beautiful. As the sun lowered slightly over the skyline, Ethan realized that the greatest return on any investment was not measured in profit, but in watching someone step confidently into a future they once feared might not exist. Years later on, another quiet winter morning, snow began to fall over West Madison Street once again. The city moved with its usual rhythm, cars gliding past glass towers, pedestrians hurrying toward warm buildings. But near the entrance of St. Anne's Medical Center, something had changed. A small plaque now rested beside the sliding doors, engraved with simple words, honoring the Harper Care Initiative and the belief that no family should face illness alone. Lily Harper stood there, no longer a teenager, but a medical student volunteering during her winter break. A white coat rested over her shoulders, her name stitched neatly above the pocket. She paused for a moment beneath the same streetlight that once flickered above her basket of flowers. The memory no longer carried cold. It carried direction. Inside the hospital, Sarah Harper worked part-time as a patient liaison, offering comfort in waiting rooms where fear often lingered. She understood that sometimes what people needed most was not only treatment, but reassurance. Across the street, a familiar black car slowed at the intersection. Ethan Caldwell stepped out, older now, but steadier than ever. He joined Lily near the entrance, both of them watching snow settle softly against the pavement. "Full circle," Lily said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Second chances rarely come alone," he replied. They stood there without ceremony, two lives once separated by tinted glass and winter wind, now connected by purpose that extended far beyond a single act of generosity. The city continued around them, unaware that something extraordinary had once begun on this very sidewalk. And as snow covered the street in clean white silence, The echo of that first meeting remained not as a reminder of struggle but as proof that one moment of compassion can reshape countless tomorrows. Did this story touch your heart? Let us know how you felt. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments below. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss our next heartfelt story. Click the end screen to watch more emotional journeys. See you in the next one.